The Supreme Court's Impact on Racial Equality by Troy Sturgeon. The politicization of the Supreme Court contributed to both setbacks and progress for the African American community's civil rights. Setbacks included the civil rights cases of 1883 and Plessy v. Ferguson, decided in 1896. Progress includes the case of Brown v. Board of Education. The aftermath of the Civil War. The 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution abolished slavery, stating, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction." The 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution states, "No state shall make or enforce any laws which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of any citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protections of the laws." Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1875. At this point in time, Congress was way ahead of the Supreme Court and even ahead of society. African Americans were finally gaining rights after their release from servitude. The Civil Rights Act of 1875 established that every citizen within the United States, regardless of color or race, would be entitled to reap the benefits of the following: all advantages, facilities, accommodations, inns, theaters, and all other places of public enjoyment. If these privileges were denied, restitution from a federal court was available. This is an image of the Waite Court that determined the outcome of the civil rights cases in 1883. The civil rights cases. The composition of the court during the civil rights cases was mainly made up of Republicans. The Waite Court, named after Chief Justice Morrison Waite, decided the civil rights cases in 1883. The court was entirely comprised of white men, and every Supreme Court justice on the Waite Court was nominated by a Republican president. The court ruled that the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was unconstitutional. The reasoning the court used was that simply because an individual was within the boundary of the state does not make them a state actor. Private acts of racial discrimination were no more than private wrongs that the government and the court were powerless to fix. The decision in the civil rights cases of 1883 essentially legalized private discrimination. This was a major setback. This is an image of the Fuller Court from 1896. The Fuller Court was the court that determined the case of Plessy v. Ferguson. The Fuller Court, named after Chief Justice Melvin Fuller, decided the case of Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896. The court was once again entirely comprised of white men. The Fuller Court was comprised of 6 justices that were nominated by Republican presidents and 3 justices that were nominated by Democratic presidents. The court upheld the state of Louisiana's racial discrimination on its railway systems. The court reasoned that separate but equal facilities, as long as they were substantially equal, satisfied the 14th Amendment. The court further stated that if the civil and political rights of both races be equal, one cannot be inferior to the other civilly or politically. If one race be inferior to the other socially, the Constitution of the United States cannot put them upon the same plane. How is it possible that the ideologies of the legislative branch and the judicial branch could be so completely different? There was a lack of minority representation within the Supreme Court. The first African American Supreme Court justice was not nominated to the Supreme Court until the year 1967, long after the civil rights movement, it was almost coming to an end by that point. The first female Supreme Court justice was not nominated to the Supreme Court until 1981. This should come as no surprise because of the prerequisites required to be nominated to serve on the Supreme Court of the United States. African Americans and women were not afforded the same opportunities as white men during this time. In order to be nominated by the president to serve on the Supreme Court, you have to have an amazing legal resume, a lot of the nominations actually come from appellate court judges. The politicization of the Supreme Court controls the outcome of cases. Presidents nominate like-minded justices to serve life terms on the Supreme Court. Presidents choose justices that they believe will push issues that they support and will fight against the issues they do not support. It is important again to remember that during the early years of the Supreme Court, the court had no minority representation. I posted 2 pictures here on this slide of Justice Thurgood Marshall, who was nominated in 1967 and was the first African American nominated to the Supreme Court. And on your right, we have Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, who was nominated in 1981. She was the first female Supreme Court justice. So up until the year 1967, the Supreme Court had not one single member that could consider themselves a member of a minority. The politicization of the Supreme Court. Republican Supreme Court nominations. Republican presidents tend to nominate conservative Supreme Court justices. Conservative justices tend to be anti-abortion, against marriage equality for homosexuals, and promote the Second Amendment's right to bear arms. Conservative justices favor tradition and the status quo. Conservative justices also generally try to decipher the original intent of the Founding Fathers when deciding constitutional issues. Democratic presidents tend to nominate liberal Supreme Court justices. Liberal justices tend to be pro-choice, in support of marriage equality for homosexuals, and support of gun law reform and stronger background checks. Liberal justices tend to support expanding individual liberties, and they tend to view the Constitution more as a living document that needs to change and adapt to fit the needs of our society. How exactly is the Supreme Court affected by politics? The 12-year presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt probably had the greatest political impact on the composition of the Supreme Court. During Franklin Delano Roosevelt's presidency from 1933 to 1945, he was able to appoint 8 Supreme Court justices to the Supreme Court. All of his nominations were Democratic, liberal-leaning justices. The Supreme Court of 1954, which heard the landmark case of Brown v. Board of Education, consisted of 8 justices nominated by Democratic presidents. The only justice on the Warren Court of 1954 that was not nominated by a Democratic president was Chief Justice Earl Warren, who had no political affiliation and was nominated by Republican President Dwight Eisenhower. One member, Justice Harold Burton, was the only justice on this court to proclaim himself a Republican. The other 3 justices of this court were nominated by Democratic President Harry Truman. The packing of the court with liberal justices set up the perfect storm for Brown v. Board of Education. This is an image of the Warren Court from 1954 that heard the case of Brown v. Board of Education. Brown v. Board of Education. The Warren Court, named after Chief Justice Earl Warren, decided the case of Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. The court was entirely comprised of white men. The Warren Court was comprised of 8 justices that were nominated by Democratic presidents. Chief Justice Earl Warren was nominated by Republican President Dwight Eisenhower. Chief Justice Earl Warren had no political affiliation and was quite liberal. The court had to decide whether the segregation of public education based solely on race violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The court ruled unanimously that segregation of public education based solely on race did violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment and prohibited segregation in public schooling. The court reasoned that separate but equal facilities were not actually substantially equal, and the separation promotes a feeling of inferiority in African American children that would have a detrimental impact on their education and personal development. This case obviously broadened the horizons for African Americans and gave them new hope in our country. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.